Hello and welcome to this week's episode of The Insider, brought to you, just for a change, by Vanishing Inc. And in fact, welcome to the new season. There's a whole host of amazing guests planned, but this episode features not one, no, not two, but three incredible guests. We have writer Rick Worth, illustrator Jordan Culver, and for the third time on this podcast, because he just can't get enough, Professor Richard Wiseman. Welcome all. It's a short show. There's no time for pleasantries. We're cracking on with the questions. I understand this whole project. I haven't explained the project. The project is this project, the incredible new hardback book version of Hocus Pocus. But I will get into the details. But I understand this whole project started with a tweet. Rick, a pre-Musk tweet. Rick, can you tell us about it?
Yeah, it was very much pre-Musk. So it was around Christmas one year, and Richard had impishly tweeted that for the next 10 minutes he would reveal the secret to any illusion. And it just so happened to be that I needed to know how Houdini had wrote on a chalkboard in his when Arthur Conan Doyle was on tour in the USA, and Richard didn't tell me the secret. One, he said something like, "Oh, I've just been researching that this very afternoon," and I sat waiting for him to tell me how it happened, but he never did. So then I think after that, I think I'd had a few beers, and at that point was feeling quite brave. So then I think I sent Richard a comic that John and I had made called A Certain Symmetry about Houdini and Doyle, and then I think he liked it, and then it kind of grew from there.
Now, that first comic, A Certain Symmetry, contains two illusions, which does seem slightly unusual for a comic. They feature an elephant and a goat. Can you describe them for the listeners, viewers?
So that was that after A Certain Symmetry. So A Certain Symmetry is just like a kind of a short story about them kind of competing and being friends. But the first things we did with Richard was a goat, which is based on a similar illusion where you cut it out and the goat's eyes follow you around the room. Cause
it's a dragon in the original.
In the original, yeah. And then the other one, the Vanishing the Elephant puzzle, which when I saw it again the other day, I was actually like, this is way more impressive than I remember it being. It was the tale of how Houdini had vanished Jenny the elephant on stage and how the method is, still not fully revealed, and Steinmeier kind of thought it was a donkey and all this kind of thing. But what happened is you cut the comic into quarters and you rotate the quarters, and then the elephant that's in the center vanishes. So I think from there we kind of had this idea that you could use comics to perform illusions and they would be integrated into the story.
Now, Richard, those that follow you and are aware of your work will know that you're very active in the skepticism arena. How did you marry discussing paranormal stories whilst also presenting the alternate views on these phenomena?
Well, that was the sort of key idea behind the comic that I thought, wouldn't it be amazing if I could take our sort of shared love of the paranormal and magic and psychology and put it all together in one amazing sort of colourful, fast-moving comic and actually tell these stories which, I read about as a kid and got so excited about, but through sort of comic book form. And so Jordan and Rick, incredibly talented, amazing at coming up with these wonderful ways of retelling these stories. And that was really the birth of the project. So it hopefully gets skepticism out to new audiences, but also really within the magic community, just celebrates our love of magic and the past. We all stand on the shoulders of giants and,
Sure.
and being returning to those stories of Keller and Thurston and so on, and just remembering where we come from, I think is really helpful.
Yeah. Can you explain, Rick, the point that you mentioned from Scott McCloud's excellent understanding comics about storytelling?
So any aspect of it in terms of comics as a storytelling method or
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so
yeah, comics.
It's quite a broad thing. So there's quite a lot of interesting things within comics themselves that make them a very unique storytelling method. And a lot of those things are the same as magic, in that comics don't show you a lot. They show you what you think you need to see, and your mind fills in the spaces in between. Like literally those little white lines in between the panels. Your mind is saying, "Well, the axe was risen in this panel, and then in the next panel, someone was screaming. Therefore, the axe fell." Now, if you put two more panels at either side of that, you can change that narrative completely. So, kind of making comics about magic felt like there's this similar kind of area where a magician shows you one thing, and then something happens. And it's your mind that says, well, that teleported, or there's no way that lady can be in half. So it's that kind of gap there. And I think, actually, I was listening to this very podcast, and Andy Nyman was talking about, making a coin disappear. And he says you can do that two ways. You can speak very fast and say, there's the coin, I click my fingers and it's gone. And then he kind of ad-libbed this, there's the coin, and he's talking about his powers and where he needs to look, and he really crafted the story around it. And it just made it a lot richer. So, a lot of because there are effects in the book, a lot of these effects are interesting and fun on the page on their own, but putting that narrative over the top of it kind of, well, firstly, it masks the effect a little bit, so it's not as obvious to see what we're doing, but it also enriches it and gives it a reason to be there rather than just, and now we're going to do a force. It's worthwhile it being there.
Yeah, absolutely. Jordan, the artwork is simply beautiful, descriptive, and there's a way that your eyes are continually drawn to the next panel. Is there a method? I know this is a podcast for magicians, but it reminded me of misdirection or direction, that a magician will make you look where they want you to look. And there were many panels that forced my eyes to move in a certain way. Is there a specific method? Is there a deliberate thing that you're doing to cause people to follow the way you want them to do?
Well, I'm really glad to hear that, because Rick and I will work together a lot of the time to specifically to create that effect. I mean, that's one of my favorite things to do in comics, is to guide the reader's eye over the page for storytelling purposes, but specifically for the Hocus Pocus, series. It was also to create illusion on the page. And within comics craft, generically speaking, it's just page design, but your sort of template comics page would be sort of a grid structure, right? You've got rectangular or square panels, and you just read from top to the right, middle, and then bottom in the same pattern. In Western comics, it's opposite if you're reading sort of manga. But there's so much more you can do with that within, outside of a grid structure. Breaking the rules and kind of bending things, and you want it to be clear to the reader where to go next, right? We wanted to kind of pull all these stunts and do really interesting things visually, narratively, magically. But you don't want it to be confusing. It needs to be intuitive. It needs to feel like it just naturally pulls the reader along. And a lot of that is through kind of visual cues and design work of the layout, panel composition. You need to make sure that the way that all of the different elements on the panel are organized in such a way that it pulls you along. Even something like speech bubble placement. So when a character speaks, you need to think carefully about who's speaking first on the left or the right of the page, of the panel rather, so that your eye is in the right spot for the next bit of action to kind of pick up and move along. So so that's with the dialogue, or the shape of a panel can kind of overlap on top of another one, which is a subtle cue that they're related in some way. So there's a lot of different tricks, and it was really fun to be able to kind of play with those to lots of different effect and throughout the book.
How clever. Now, the first comic, because let's just rewind slightly. It came out as 5 separate comics and launched at Blackpool in 2020 and was a huge success. And this is the first time this is great for audio listeners. I'm holding up a copy of the hardback book, and it's hardback and it's beautiful. But this is the first time all 5 have been collated into one beautiful edition. and the 5 comics cover different topics. The first comic is billed as being able to read your mind. Professor Wiseman, can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, we wondered how to really sort of theme the issues. And so we came up with mind reading for the first one. There's levitation later on, predicting the future and so on. And as we were launching at Blackpool, we decided to really make it as complicated as possible and as magical as possible. So it's not only that there are interactives in there, so the reader can perform magic, but also there are tricks hidden in there. So magicians can have that book around their house and actually use it to perform illusions on friends and family and so on. So it's got 2 layers of interactivity. And we're not the first people to do that second one. Richard Himber famously faked up a copy of a well-known sort of magazine like Reader's Digest so that magicians could use it and so on. So yeah, that was the kind of thinking behind that. And that's the issue that also talks about Alexander as well. So his life story is in there. So it's an exciting project to work on.
Absolutely. Now, I want to talk, and this is just, and having seen Jordan and Rick's faces, maybe my question is wrong because I'm older and I'm more in the Wiseman camp. But I want to talk about the sound effects in the comic, because when it's a very specific one, when Washington Irving Bishop dies, not much of a spoiler because it's on page 4 or something, you see, and I've got it written down, Gleep, thonk, onk, onk, onk. Now, I'm not sure who made the Rick, is that you that wrote the sound effects?
Yeah, most of
Okay,
them.
so the question is, I'm not sure, but they hugely remind me of Don Martin's work from Mad. And there's also some page folding elements that were also famous in Mad.
Mm-hmm.
Was that something that was in it? Did Don Martin inspire your sound effects, and did the page turning ideas come from Mad? That's my question.
Well, they wasn't directly inspired by Mad. Obviously, you know, the kind of the Mad folds are, you know, famous / infamous. So as soon as we started doing the page folds, you kind of getting into Mad magazine. We didn't do any of the kind of here's a phrase that doesn't really make sense, and then you fold the page in and it still doesn't make sense really, but it's a bit of a gag. As for the sound effects, like, you know, there are many schools of comic sound effect. You'd you might be surprised to hear. Jordan and I are of the school of one, making them very silly, but still hopefully representing what's supposed to be happening. So that dunk dunk dunk, I believe, is Bishop's head banging on the stairs as he goes up, if I'm recalling it correctly. But I think there's also a part in that strip where someone falls over, and the sound effect is trip. In you know, some people wouldn't be like, well, that's not the noise it makes, but it kind of, because it's in that comics format, the actual sound and the actual word don't have to match. But what I really did take from Mad, and luckily Richard was there to temper me, otherwise we could have really got into trouble, is that the kind of almost poking fun at some of these figures. Now, not in a mean way, you know, particularly if they're dead, it didn't matter so much. But where I did kind of like the sort of anarchist element of Mad, so some of that did kind of come in. I don't know if Jordan can speak to any sound effects.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of times with the nature of a collaboration, I think it's sometimes even hard to parse between which idea was whose and that sort of thing. But a lot, you know, I will be given the script that Richard came up with. He'll most often have sound effects, but sometimes I might think that the artwork might be enhanced by an additional sound, in which case I'll just come up with that. Or maybe I'll embellish a sound effect, like you might just say the pages of the book are turning, like flip or something, and then I'll make it something more specific. But yeah, there are sort of conventional sound effects within comics generally, and you can play off of those and riff off of them. I think the one where Bishop is having his fit on stage and collapsing and falling over, I remember coming up with that and just thinking, what would someone spasming and falling onto the stage, rigid as a board, sound like? And it's so much fun. I mean, like sometimes even Rick and I on social media will, you know, a lot of times you'll see comic artists say, hey, what's the sound effect for a slingshot? Or what's the sound effect for this? And then, you know, it's really fun to just see people's responses. You get all these ridiculous ones. And Even there's examples of really literal interpretations. So I think at one point a character opens the door and the sound effect is barge. Or this is in a 2000 AD comic, so I can't take credit for it. But somebody throws somebody out the window, and instead of smash, the artist wrote the word defenestration, which means to throw somebody out the window. So there's lots of fun gags you can do with sound effects and that sort of things, and also referencing kind of comics history and the traditions within cartooning, which is great.
Yeah, no, it just very much reminds me of Don Martin. Now, Professor Wiseman, there are specific techniques like muscle reading and let's be fair, basic levitation and so on that are exposed in the comic. Did you get any fuss from anti-exposure types about this, or did it just fly under the radar?
Oh, it's not under the radar. I mean, but I don't think there's anything in there that would upset anyone. I mean, I think cold reading is in there.
Mm-hmm.
I think muscle reading is in there. There's the old thing where you do the floating finger sausage illusion.
Mm-hmm.
But we were really, really careful to make certain there's nothing in there that would upset magicians, and we've never had any comments about that at all.
Yeah, okay.
So the interactivity is in there, and I want it to be a celebration of magic, like everything I do.
Sure.
And also, really, what you want to do, like all good magic books, is make that spark of curiosity, so that people then want to find out about these things rather than just telling them straight away. So often we cut out quite a lot of material if I thought it strayed anywhere near exposure at all.
Talking of cutting out, there's a segue, right? There are 5 different comics in the book, and it's mind reading, seances, ghosts, prophets, and levitation. How did you land on those 5 topics, and what was considered but cut out?
Well, so this project started about 3 years ago, something like that. The 3 of us have only met up in person once. I mean, this is
That's true.
Sort of, the kind of wonder of the internet and Zoom.
Sure.
And the downside of the pandemic. So we met up just before the pandemic, and we sat down and thought, how are we going to do this? How do you get this all to work? And we came up with the themes there. And we just riffed on those themes to come up with individual stories. So when it gets to ghosts, I said, Borley Rectory is good, and talk about infrasound is good, and Pepper's Ghost, there's quite a lot visually there, and so on. So that's how we did it. And occasionally we would come up with a story that we couldn't quite make work, and we dropped that one. But for the most part, I think something like 90% of the stories that we came up with that initial meeting ended up being in the comic.
Okay.
Mm.
In the seance comic, you talk about the story of Kate and Margaret Fox. For the uninitiated, the creators of spiritualism. In the comic, there's a frame where they both look a little bit ashamed of what they'd done, almost like they wanted to tell the truth. Now, I must admit, although being aware of them creating it, I don't know the details of the story. But in the end, do you know whether they did end up regretting or feeling bad about what they'd done?
I think this is something that we had to. Sorry, I had to jump in. We did. I think we had a bit of a back and forth about this, because I think we did go further into what happened with them. It was a lot more tragic than the age range of the comic that we wanted. I think ultimately one of them became an alcoholic, and she did recount in there. But I think it was the eldest sister who was the manager of the 2 younger girls. She stuck with it for the long time. I might be getting my history a bit mixed up there, and I'm sure there's some spiritualist historian out there be like, no. But it's one of the things, I think we drew it and we had the writing, but then we kind of like, we had to temper this writing because it's a bit strong, and what it implies is a bit too dark for the audience. But it's also one of those things is, like in the we have the one about Nostradamus. Now we don't really know how Nostradamus felt about his work. Presumably he was chuffed with it, but in that we kind of added this emotional element over the top that he kind of, it ran away with him, and he just wanted to help people at first. And so at the end there's a bit where he's quite remorseful about what people have done in his name, and that's kind of where we played liberties with the narrative, because these characters can't just be 2-dimensional props to just tell you things. The reader has to kind of believe that they're real and that they have emotional resonance as well. So hopefully that kind of comes through with the that I always feel bad for the Fox sisters, and I'm not sure why. I don't feel the same sympathy for the Davenport brothers, even though they kind of got that kind of parallel universe that they're right next to each other. It's two sets of siblings, but yeah, I feel sympathy for the Foxes. I don't know why.
So maybe it's your personal whatsits that came through.
Yeah.
Now, I had heard the story about the creation of the Ouija board from the awesome Stuff You Should Know podcast, but listeners to this might not know the frankly remarkable origin story. Can you share it briefly? Who wants to tackle the Ouija board origin story?
It's going back a bit now. I'm trying to remember. I can even remember it. Well, let's go one stage back. I think that we lay claim to the best researched magic comic of all time, because we often went back and forth with people all over the world, magicians all over the world, to try and get our facts straight, because there's a lot of stuff out there on the web that simply isn't true. And I should say the comic is also full of in-jokes for magicians and also magicians in there in cameo roles, and so it's quite fun to go through and see how many you spot. I mean, I don't think we've ever counted it up, Jordan, but it's a large number of cameos in there.
There's several per chapter were issues, now chapters in the book. So yeah, I would guess,
Should I do the question about that? There are several in-jokes, Easter eggs, and magic cameos in the comics. Can you give a couple of those away? I spotted Chris Kenner.
Oh yes, okay, Chris Kenner's in there. And
is Reece Shearsmith in there as well?
Yes. I mean,
do I get points?
Yes, there are several per, as Jordan said, there are several per a story. So in the first issue, Richard Kaufman is in there, Stan Allen is in there, David Britland is in there. So when people sort of helped us out, we put them in there as a cameo, and friends of mine and so on. So it's quite fun. Plus, there's loads of in-magic jokes. And Ian Keeble was very kind in his review and sort of said, this is the best research magic comic. And we hope all the facts are right. We really tried to get that straight. So it's very exciting. And it does allow us to retell. I mean, what's amazing about what Rick and Jordan do is that you can travel through time and across the world in like one box, as it were, or one page, and it allows for this very unique form of storytelling, and magic is very well suited to that. So if you're talking about Borley Rectory, you can tell a little bit about Price, then you can zoom in and suddenly be in the rectory and be part of his investigation, and zoom back out again. Yeah. So it was a lot of fun. So I'm so used to the written word and things just sort of flowing in a kind of straightforward way, because I write nonfiction. But to work with these guys and to find out this completely alternative and really magical way of telling stories was amazing.
And we tried to kind of fit that in thematically as well. So, for example, in the levitation issue, we crafted the narrative so that it fits thematically with the idea of levitation. So the character kind of rises out of her box, and then it's like a floating hot air balloon basket, almost just kind of levitating. And then she's floating over the page, kind of over looking the narrative, the history expanse timeline of levitation history. So she's going from panel to panel like the reader, but in a levitating kind of way. So in each issue, we try to do stuff like that too, to match it, which is also fun.
That's so cool.
And my favourite one of those, which is down to the genius of these two folks, was the seance one, where you just, on one side of the page, you see the seance phenomena, a floating tambourine or whatever it is. But when you shine a light through the page, the page becomes translucent, and you see the method. You see the reaching rod that the medium's using, and so on. So it's actually using, and then Pepper's Ghost uses a similar sort of optical illusion. So it's using the comic to really explore magical ways of storytelling and these sort of new forms of illusion. It's an exciting project to work on.
That's so incredible. Now, with the spiritualism one, you touch on the fact that the world was a pretty horrible place to live in during the Great War, and possibly that impacted people's desire to believe in something, anything to help them, like spiritualism. Now, this is a bit of a heavy question, but do you think there's a risk now, with everything horrible that's going on in the world today, that we're making room for a resurgence of belief in super or paranormal things? Have you seen that happening already?
Well, traditionally, when things are hard economically, people become very anxious, very worried, and they turn to certainty. And sometimes it's the astrologers and the psychics and the mediums that offer that certainty. I mean, that's sort of traditionally the role in the past. I'm not certain we're seeing that uptick at the moment. What you are seeing an increase in is conspiracy theories. And so, again, I'm going to return to the comic. Part of it is about promoting critical thinking.
Right.
It's saying this is the law of large numbers. This is a hoax. This is how this hoax spread around the world. And so if it does any good on that front, then that's another reason, I think, to enjoy what we've done. But I think from a magic point of view, I think it's not only bringing magic history alive, but it is that interactive. It is the illusions. It is this way of storytelling. And in fact, working with Jordan and Rick, when they have to take a magical effect and just reduce it to a number of images. Mm-hmm. And so it might be the magician shows a box empty, you see a wand being waved, and then something's in the box. And I actually think there's something profound in that. I think that's how audience members remember magic. They remember it as a series of images that are kind of seared into their minds by good magicians. And so I think what you're seeing there is actually how human memory works when it comes to magic. And really good magicians understand how to sear those moments so that when they reconstruct, those become the key frames, as it were. So I think there's something quite profound about what's happening when you try and represent magic in a comic book.
Yeah, no, many guests on this show have talked about the series of still images that they want their audiences to leave with, whether it's snowstorm or whatever the lemons underneath the cups or whatever it is, but a series of still images, and that's exactly what a comic can distill a magic performance into. You tell the tale of Paul the Psychic Octopus, who predicted some sports ball something or other. I'm allergic to all sports ball, but you don't explain who set that up. Who was behind Paul?
An even bigger octopus.
It's octopus is all the way down.
Do we know? Because I remember seeing something on the interwebs about him predicting sports ball things, but
he ends up getting
who owned him?
I think it was like a fisherman or a farm, like an octopus farmer or something, wasn't it? Because I believe Paul comes to a tragic end after like undesirable results, or the team that he predicted didn't end up. I think he was eaten by the person. I can't remember. Is that right, Rick? I think it was a sort of a fisherman or something, though, that at least initially owned him.
I can't remember the research on it because I assumed it was just. I thought it was one of Germany's like national aquariums that like owned him, and it was just like a thing they were doing. I know the president of Spain threatened to eat him. I don't know if he was actually eaten at the end. I mean, quite a twist. We didn't put that in. Someone does threaten to eat him in the comic, but we didn't go like full old boy and show someone eating him in the.
In a way, it's a good example, though, of a lot of these sort of stories. They almost have like this fable element to them, and this mythic origins where there are these really tall tales or these really kind of extraordinary, kind of fanciful events, and it's really hard to even get to the bottom of like where that story started. A really good example of that is the Indian rope trick.
Yes.
That we explore, and kind of trying to parse fact from fiction. And even drawing up a chronology of these and then doing the research is extraordinarily difficult because there's lots of, not misinformation, but, wrong facts out there, as Richard said, floating around the internet. So, and that's kind of almost part of its, the effectiveness of these stories is that you kind of can't figure out what's true, what's not true, where they came from, who started the story. So yeah, Paul, for all we know, maybe was a self-made octopus and just kind of used his psychic abilities to get by.
I'm not meaning to disparage Paul or his psychic abilities.
I mean, another one like that is the Keller levitation story. The story that he goes to, a masculine invents the levitation. Keller comes over, sees again at some point, walks up on stage to find out how this is done. That never happened, as far as we can see. Loads of history books talk about Keller walking up on stage during a masculine's performance. As far as I know, it's a complete myth. So we really do try and stick to the facts as much as we can.
Now, talking of that, I just had a personal interest question about the levitation. When he brings a child up onto the stage and swears in order to get the child to do that jaw-dropped thing, is there any mention in history of what he actually said? Does anybody know what he said? Because I understand the shock at that time of an older gentleman swearing at a child must have been incredibly shocking for the child. But do we know what he said?
Yeah, I don't think we do. I mean, that story comes from Jim Steinmeier, and it's in Hiding the Elephant, which is a stunning book about theory of magic. A fantastic book. So that's where it's reported, and it's a magician who essentially bumped into somebody who's one of those kids that Thurston took up on stage. So I don't think we know exactly what Thurston said. But part of it would be the shock, because Thurston was like David Nixon. He was this sort of gentleman sort of performer, very kind of mild-mannered and so on. So to hear him swearing or even threatening the child would be quite something.
Absolutely.
I can reveal something that we had to cut out of cut out of the comic for space. So in the early draft of that sequence, he had a speech bubble, but his language was coded, and we were going to hide the letters. It was just being like a simple 1-2 code. We were going to hide them around the comic so that then you could go back and decipher exactly what he'd said to the kid. And rather than be swear words, we were going to put something like, "You're exactly the type of person who looks up dirty words in the dictionary." Something that would be like, "We know what what type of person you are," but just purely because of the space on the panel and because the story was getting quite full. Anyway, we had to that's a lot of extra work. Let's just drop that out. But yes, deep down, in a perfect world, that could have been in there still.
For the one or two people who would have
done it. Yeah.
Incidentally, in the panel where the boy comes up on stage, because as a nod to the Hiding the Elephant book, I hid an elephant behind the curtain, kind of faded in the color. So if you look on that panel to the right, there's this faded kind of elephant drawing to the side.
Now, talking of detail in the comics, Jordan, fortunately in this lovely, good for audio listeners, I'm holding up the hardback copy of the book. All of the original covers are included as an appendix in there. How long does one cover take you to draw? I've just got no idea about how long that takes, and I'm just interested.
It's pretty varied. I mean, depending on how long it takes to kind of crack, but generally speaking, probably about as long as a full page. So in a way, you can think of a cover as being one image.
Sure.
So in that respect, one panel of a page, which might normally have 5, 6, 8 panels on it, but it's much larger, more detailed. We want it to be really eye-catching and flashy and contain kind of important information, but mostly be attention grabbing and set the mood. So a lot of the time will be spent coming up with a concept, kind of the visual atmosphere we want to create. So Rick and I will kind of work together to come up with that, and then I'll sketch a whole bunch of designs. We pick the one that's the most striking, and it takes as long as it takes. I would say sometimes I'd be working on it over the course of a week, kind of dipping in and out of it while I was working on other pages. Okay. Other times it might become my obsession and I'll just work on it over, a day or two solidly. But it's quite varied. We'll just sort of pick away at it until we think that, that's the finished cover.
I mean, the idea of it ever being finished is so difficult because one of my favorite elements on one of the covers on the final levitation cover, like we thought, oh, that's it. It looks absolutely beautiful. And then I don't know whether John suggested or I suggested, we were like, oh, because the title runs up the page because it's levitation, we should have the boy and the merchant from the Indian rope trick story. They should be climbing the letters, and we should dangle it. And it was like, oh yeah. So we just in these little things, you think, oh, we could just add this here, and then eventually you just have to say there is a deadline. We need to stop, otherwise it'd be this baroque monstrosity.
That actually became that came from Richard. You'd suggested, oh, we should represent the rope trip somewhere on the cover because we include some portraits of some of the key characters that are in it. It's sort of like on a title card sort of way. But this was just sort of, there was a character on the front that wasn't actually in the book. She's just sort of like a made up sorceress just for visual effect. But yeah, you'd suggested, Richard, let's include the Indian rope trick. And we thought, well, where are we going to fit that? So then, yeah, we thought it's even better. Let's have it going up those letters. That creates the perfect kind of visual nod.
I mean, as you're hearing, it's a team effort. And we should say that the fourth member of the team is Owen Watts, who isn't here. It's what's called a colorist, I believe, and perhaps Jordan can speak to this. But each issue has a sort of color palette, and then I think Owen brings it alive with his sort of amazing colors. So, Jordan, I don't know if you can speak to how that happens.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks for bringing in Owen as well, because he has a really kind of important role in the visual identity of the comic. So I would do the complete covers. So I do the art and the coloring and the letters and so on, as I do on the inside. But Owen and I would work really closely together to come up with the visual identity for kind of the color palette of each story, because within each chapter or issue, there are 3 kind of individual stories that deal with a part of magic history or individual characters from magic history. And to set those apart, so they didn't kind of just all bleed together, we thought we would come up with these sort of mood-setting color palettes, and in a limited way. So we would work with, rather than the full range of everything your eye can see, really kind of stylized, reduced, not quite monochromatic, sometimes they're almost garish, but something that would reflect either the time period that the story is set in, the kind of the atmospheric mood, thematic elements, and really trying to tie it all together in a way that enhances the art and makes sense storytelling wise, and for the clarity of the information we're trying to get across. So using highlight colors to sort of bring the eye and make important elements pop, so you make sure that the reader doesn't miss those things. And Owen was great to work with because he has kind of this chromatic expertise that is beyond my kind of patience to do. So I can think, this is the kind of mood that I want. Now go and make that happen. And then he would sort of fill in the artwork in that way. And then I would put the finishing touches on it to kind of add whatever visual flair on top of those colors. Be it shading or some extra highlights, that kind of thing. But yeah, he was instrumental in creating that sort of visual identity for each story, and it worked great.
And it was amazing to see when it used to happen. But again, in terms of magic, magicians don't think of color schemes and color palettes very much. And it's working with these folks. I suddenly thought, oh my goodness, some colors go together. Some things make things pop. Magicians don't traditionally think like that. And so when they look through the book, I hope they'll kind of go, oh my goodness, I see now how this colour is used in different to separate stories, to give a mood, to make you to draw your eyes to certain elements and not others. You know, we talk about texture to routines sometimes, but not really colouring. And when you think about it, it's phenomenally important. I think again that's what the book brings to life.
Proves it. It proves it. It absolutely proves it. The final comic in the book focuses on levitation, as we just touched on with the cover. Now, the use of ether reminded me a little of Darren's notion of, at the beginning anyway, of saying that it was a lot of NLP. Do you think, Professor Wiseman, having an excuse or a reason for something paranormal helps to sell it?
Well, it provides a false explanation. And so we're creatures that like explanations, and once we've got one, we stop searching for other ones. I mean, it gets back to the conspiracy theories and critical thinking again.
Right.
So once we're told it's ether, or we're told it's body language, or we're told it's NLP, we stop searching for other explanations. And so obviously that helps you in terms of hiding method. But you see that throughout the whole comic. I mean, we often talk about mediums and psychics. They're all providing effects. They're all providing explanations. And it's more fun, and people are more motivated to believe that someone can predict the future or look at their palm and tell them all about themselves. That's a more compelling story than looking for the method, you know, the grubby facts of cold reading. And so you get into what's called motivated reasoning. That not only is it an explanation, it's one we want to believe. And again, magicians don't do that very much. They normally just click their fingers or throw some confetti in the air.
Yeah.
But thinking through what is the effect here, I think would be helpful and interesting.
I absolutely wish I had some confetti right now, but
That would be everything's better with confetti. Yes,
I haven't. Now, a lot of the comics are genuinely funny. I did laugh out loud at several moments. Shipton's Yorkshire accent, someone calling for Freebird during the demonstration. So I'm even laughing thinking about that now. Davenport's spirit cabinet, Henry, the second wife, talking like a cockney, and the nod to the Flintstones with the clocking off bird tail pull. Is there a process for injecting those jokes? Are you aiming for a joke every certain number of pages? Is there a process in injecting the jokes into the comic?
There's not like a kind of set like this is how you do it, and this is how you do a joke on a page. It's just kind of you get a feel for like okay we've had enough pure learning now. We need something funny. And actually, having read Paranormality, if I can say it right, like Richard's books are quite humorous. There's like a kind of, there is always a wink to the reader. But what comics allow you to do, in like when Jordan and I first started saying like, what do we want it to feel like? I said, there used to be these Disney cartoons where it'd be Goofy like trying a new sport, and you'd see him saying playing baseball, and the voiceover would be deadpan telling you how to play baseball and what the positions are and what he's supposed to be doing, and Goofy would be inevitably failing or doing something preposterous. So you can create that juxtaposition between you being told something very deeply serious and then we're showing you something very, very silly. But then stuff like Catherine de Medici coming in and shouting at everyone and being really uncouth, that's just like, well, she's only got one line. She's just going to come in and say hello. You're not altering history by, but by having her be rude. No one really cares if that's an accurate portrayal of her. She just needs to get Nostradamus in the room while you explain why he's there. I heard, Vic and Bob talk about, they would write these sketches and then they'd go through every line one by one and say, well, we walk through a door here. How do we make this funny? And you say, well, your hat's too big. So you try to pick up like little things like that, just things you can put in that they don't alter the story too much at all.
Yeah.
And I think the Freebird thing might have even come in when we were doing the final draft to send everything off to the publisher, right? Maybe we just saw that opportunity.
Yeah, I think it was a missed opportunity because it was somebody holding up a candle. He had a match. He had a match. Like you hold up your phone or your lighter at a concert. We thought, this is a missed opportunity because he's ruining the show anyway. We'll make him
the call for Freebird was my favourite joke in the whole thing. Now, we're running out of time, so we've got a couple of questions left. But there is a substantial further reading section in the book. How important was it to you all to push people to read more about the topics that you discuss in the comics?
Oh, crucial. Absolutely crucial. I mean, what is wonderful about magic, it has this astonishing history. When it gets into the paranormal stuff, they're incredible stories. You're learning about science, you're learning about psychology, you're learning about how the mind works. Why wouldn't we want to share that literature with as many people as possible? So the book pushes people to those sources. In a comic like this, you can't be covering all of the information which is out there. So hopefully it's a springboard for people then to get into that stuff.
Yeah. No, I think it's super important. At the end, there's a list of thank yous, and this muscly American bloke I know called Joshua J gets a thank you at the end. Was his thank you just for turning it into a hardback book, or did he have something to do with the original comics? I'm just curious.
It's thanking him for being him.
No, I do that nearly every day.
We should do. Yes. So no, I'm a big fan of Josh's stuff. So we were very, very excited when Vanishing Ink took the project on to put it all together, and they've been great. And the finished project, finished project. It's late. It's getting late in the day. I'm not in bed by now. The finished product even looks astonishing. And that was something we wanted all the way through, that sort of really have a product which celebrates the sort of astonishing work that's gone into it. And it has been a huge amount of work. As I say, I think this is three something years working away on this. So it's great to be sharing it with loads of people.
Well, I hope that as many people listening to this, because I know how many people listen to it. And if everybody listening to it now goes to vanishinginkmagic.com and buys it, it will almost instantly be one of our best-selling books. So that's your mission, podcast listeners, YouTube viewers. Right now, go to vanishinginkmagic.com. There's probably a banner for it. If you're listening to this in the recent time after we've recorded it, if this is 4 years down the line, there won't be a banner. But if you type in Hocus Pocus, you will find this delightful book, and you should buy it. That's what I think. What do you think, Richard? Should they buy it?
I would say buy it. I mean, it's good for your physical and mental health. So I think absolutely get out there and buy it. More to the point, we worked really hard. So
you had nothing else to do, Richard. It was lockdown.
I had very little to do. But it wasn't nothing.
Jordan, do you think it would make a good gift for a friend or family member?
You know, it would be the perfect gift. And we're a little past Christmas right now, but there's birthdays presumably coming up, or there's never a bad time to treat yourself to a present. You know,
Easter, it could be a perfect Easter gift.
The daily joys of existence. You know, you got to reward that with books.
Absolutely.
And to add to that, you can buy
go on, Rick. Who else can buy it?
Well, if you hate it, you can buy it and give it to your enemies, and it's all the same to us.
Gentlemen all, thank you so much for giving us your time. I do appreciate it hugely. And Hocus Pocus is available now. This has been The Insider. Thank you very much to Jordan, Rick, and Richard. I wish you all a joyous rest of your evening, and thank you very much indeed for your time.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Boom. We're out.